to our Creation Watch. This is a new person that I'm engaging with, and let me see here. First, I'll show you their channel just to give you an idea of who we're dealing with. This person's name is Tom Short. Seems to be an apologist, public speaker kind of individual. Has the typical apologetics that we're used to dealing with here in the Hive. We got the tragic story of Charles Darwin. How did life begin? But also more doctrinal review stuff like walk as Christ walked, and did God make everything? That's more did we evolve by chance? More evidentialism is what you're going to see there. Facing the impossible situation, bring it to Jesus, this kind of stuff. But today we are actually going to look at a very specific video, and let me pull that one up now. Come on. Here we go. And this, I bring this up because I talked to Cindy Lincoln, as I've mentioned earlier in the show last week, over on Amy Newman's channel, and there was this sort of layer of dismissal to the fossil record that I could not understand. Fossils don't prove blah blah blah. Did Mark guess ambly pygid or pidgid? Did you? I'm sorry if I missed your guess, and I'm scrolling back up to see, because if you got it before I said it, I want to give you credit, Mark. Oh, you've been trying to spell it. Yeah, for a long time I called them amblypygids, but when I spoke to Walker, just a walking fish, who I haven't talked to in forever, I hope they're doing okay. Anyway, when I was talking to them about it, they let me know that the proper pronunciation due to its Greek origin would be amblypygids, so I started using that instead. Anyway. Yeah, let's dive into Tom Short's exploration of the fossil record. Now, he's not a huge channel, 1.85 thousand viewers, so that's bigger than me, about twice as big as me actually. 160 views on this video alone, and we'll look at the comments maybe after we're done watching it. But let us blow this sucker up and give it a go. 17 minutes, but let me see. He's got an intro. Okay, just looking at the sections. I think we should be good to go. We're going to watch the intro too. See how that goes.
Good morning and welcome to our Daily Word and Prayer. My name is Tom Short. So glad to have you along with us today as we talk about the Word of God. And we're talking specifically about creation and evolution. Today we want to look a little bit at fossils. Now, this is a big topic, and I can't hope to really cover it fully here in the next 12 to 15 minutes. I'd like to share some things that might help you look at fossils in a little different way. When I ask students on campus why they believe in evolution, one of the most common things I hear is that they say the fossil record. And when they talk about that, they're usually talking about human fossils. And so I'd like to show you what they mean usually when they say the fossil record. Here it is. This is a similar picture of what I saw in about, I don't know, I was probably 10 years old, maybe 8 years old, the day I became an evolutionist. It was summertime. I had to read a book. Mom and Dad bought these Time Life science books, and I had one on evolution, and I saw a picture like this, and I opened it up.
I have a... Oh, I got to show you. Hold on, I'll be right back. So, let me just pull this up real quick. Just a second. I want to show you this. So, early man. I grew up with this book. I had the whole set. This whole life set. I think this is the set he's talking about too. Because I grew up with these, but I inherited it from my grandparents when they moved just recently in the last couple of months. Inherited the full set from them, and the only one that was missing was this one, because me and my brother wore it out reading through it because it has. Let me see. It's got the full chart in here. Wish I knew what page it was on. There's the OG of this image in here. It has some great. I mean, this is a great book. Look at that. Look at these. I've read this book through cover to cover. Yeah, you get it's a full version of this, is what he's talking about. So once we get, and as you go through, here we go. Oh my gosh, yes, here it is. Here it is in all of its glory. You get the full from Gibbons on up, and then ta-da, you get boom. Okay, this is the OG. This is where all of this origins come from, right? Or the big complaint about the way that's displayed in there. And it comes from both sides, and I can see the reason for the complaint, because people's expectations of what you're seeing in this book, and again, this is not new. This is this copy is printed 1970. So this book is older than me by like 13 years. So it's an old book and old information, but it's nostalgic to me. But people like our friend here, Tom, are expecting that this like literally is a representation of, this creature right here on the left gave birth to the creature next to it, and then that creature gave birth to the creature next to it at some point. Like, not saying that every generation, like there'll be like 50 generations of the one on the left, and then all of a sudden it gives birth to the next one over, and then there'll be like 160 generations of that, and all of a sudden it'll give birth to the one. That's not how it happens. That's not how these transitions to occur. Subtle changes over time, over millions of years, over thousands of generations, small incremental changes that are imperceptible from each generation. You just picked this so you could show off your OG March of Progress, didn't you? Yeah, I kind of did. I didn't. I meant to have this book in here ready for me to show it off. Yeah, the March of Progress is just representation. It's not supposed to be hyper accurate, and that's why it's so easy to. And that's why I'm like, let's stop using it. But I love it because it's such a beautiful representation, right? But because the average person looking at it will feel like they're being misled or lied to because it doesn't actually represent functional reality. Then they dismiss the whole concept of evolution as a whole, even though it's just supposed to be snapshots of of development along a lineage. It's just supposed to be like, jump forward to the descendant, 10 million years in the future or whatever.
I sat there on the couch just as a young boy, and I said, well, that makes sense. The figure on the left looks like the monkey I saw in the zoo. The figure on the right kind of looks like my dad. It seems so obvious, so simple. It was in a book. It was full living color. What are their problems with this picture? Are there problems in this picture? I start off by saying, first of all, how do they know all this stuff just from bones? How do they know how much hair someone had from bones? How do they know the skin color from bones? How do they know the reality?
They don't know the skin color and all that from the bones. They know the skin color from the latitude And we can look at a map nowadays and see where skin color is driven almost exclusively by your proximity to the equator. So if we find bones closer to the equator, we assume that the organism had darker skin. If we find it further from the equator, we can interpret that it had fairer skin. This is not obviously not a hard fast rule, and people do migrate into areas and have not been in those areas long enough to have go through those physiological changes, but many groups have. We've been spread all over our genus Homo has been spread all over North, all from I don't want to say North America. We haven't been there that long, but we've been all over Africa, Europe, and Asia, and into the islands of Southeast Asia for hundreds of thousands of years, developing these physiological characteristics and success of the darker skinned individuals as they get closer to the equator. But we've only been in Australia for 50,000 years, in North America for North and South America, I think it's for like 25,000 years. So those groups haven't experienced so much of this evolutionary process with the melanin in the skin. And also we've moved away from living so much outdoors and being in the exposed to the elements so much. So it's not as much of a factor anymore, though there are certain characteristics that it can cause a problem. But yeah, let's move on.
They didn't even have full skeletons of these animals. They just had partial bones or a hip bone or a thigh bone or a part of a skull or something like this. You actually go to a place like the Smithsonian Museum and you see how few bones they actually have and how much of it really is speculation.
Well, it's not though. It's because, for a hominid skeleton, generally we don't find a lot. It's very fragmentary. But remembering that humans are bilateral, so whatever you find of this side of the body is going to match on that side of the body. So already there, whatever bones you find, unless they are mirror images of each other, you have 50% more than what you would what you actually see. You have 50% more of the skeleton than what you're actually looking at. So when you see a museum display and it only has a couple pieces of the left side of the skull, maybe part of the eye socket, and then a full jawbone, we have the full eye socket. We have the full brow. Based on what we have just from that one side, because again, we're bilateral. So you have twice as many bones as you think you do when you visually look at it. Again, unless the one side it has an identical representation on both sides. So then you get multiple organisms, and they're not, the chances of them having exactly the same portions of exactly the same bones preserved in the fossil record is very slim. So you start filling in more of the picture. And again, each fossil that you find of a bilateral organism is actually two fossils, because there's one on each side. And I think a lot of people try to misinterpret how much we have of any organisms, whether it's dinosaurs or early hominids, based on the idea that we only have this little amount of the bones, but never consider that we actually have twice as many as what we physically have, just due to being bilateral.
And then you add in, not only do they have this artist conception of what it looked like outwardly, but I look at the last guy in the picture, the most fully formed, most fully evolved of all. There he is, a Caucasian man. He's white. He's got a nice haircut. He's shaved. He's kind of got hairier legs than me. But if you stop and think about this, if it weren't for, Schick and Gillette or some razor company, he would have a lot of facial hair. He'd have long facial hair, just like the animals that he supposedly came from.
Right. He's supposed to be a modern man, and they're representing that by saying, hey, this is modern man, and he can shave and groom his hair, cut his hair. Yeah, it's supposed to be modern man.
And this whole picture of evolving, it's so much of an art conception. It's not really,
what parts of it are speculative? There's representative species for each of these organisms. Again, I have the fold out right here. So let's see. And this is not the exact same image, but it's really close. So I think that what we're looking at here is the the Dryopithecus on the left, followed by maybe Ramnopithecus or A. africanus. I think it's based on its face. I think it's supposed to be the Australopithecine africanus. So it's supposed to be the I'm going to trip over my own tongue saying all these anthro words. Anyway, yeah. Australopithecus africanus. Good grief. I don't know why that was so hard. And then so it's not giving you, again, each individual step. Even in this, it's cut out a whole bunch of the steps. And then it gives you, I'm assuming that this is supposed to be like a Neanderthal because he's carrying the spear, or maybe Cro-Magnon man, because Cro-Magnon man is the one who carries the spear in my book. So they even skip over all the hominids. In my March of Progress, the OG one doesn't even have Erectus as a clade. It has all the individual finds of Erectus. Yeah, so it can't be your ancestor because he shaves, right?
I believe it's really accurate. But it leads us to the question, how do you even get a fossil? And as we want to talk about the fossil record, this is an important question that many people don't give enough serious attention to. How do you get a fossil? If you were to go, say you had an animal in your backyard or something, and it just fell over and died, would it fossilize? No, it wouldn't. What would have to happen for it to be fossilized? It'd have to be buried. It'd have to be buried in sediment so that it
doesn't have to be buried in sediment. It can be buried in ash. It can be buried in sand. So there are a few variables that can be carried by water, by the wind, or by volcanic or even tectonic activity. Caves are also a place where things can be fossilized in the open. So they don't even have to be buried. If they're in a cave that is isolated, the bones can mineralize in that environment as well. We have a pretty cool rhino that was preserved in a cave in a similar manner.
To take the minerals from the soil rather than decompose into the atmosphere or be eaten by scavengers, so on. To fossilize, it must be buried. And so this raises a question. How did things get buried all over the earth? Because we have fossils on top of a mountain.
So most fossils, at least sedimentary fossils, are found in, depending on what kind of fossils they are too, because like Lagerstätten is a whole different process. Amber fossilization is another process. But whatever the mineralization process that is undertaken, the most common, of course, being like he's talking about, buried in riverbeds or in lake beds where animals tend to get washed away. It doesn't have to be what he's going to claim here, a worldwide flood. It doesn't have to cover the globe. It can just be an individual rainy season. It could be a seasonal flood that washes organisms down to pile up. And we have these in real time today that didn't take a global flood. There's places where there's just washes full of bovid bones, for instance, just piles of them. It's because they die and get washed away. And when the water and the weight of the bones all collect in a certain area, and yeah, it doesn't have to be global. These finds are pretty common throughout the fossil record, both subfossil and fossil. So we know that when something is buried for thousands of years, it can still be subfossil. You still have still be bone specifically that's buried in these conditions too, but it's been buried long enough. So why do we have subfossil and fossil groups if everything was buried at the same time? I've always wondered about that. I know Mark Reed has the answer. So Mark, why do we have both subfossil and fossil bones that are buried in the same condition if fossilization is a universal process that happened across the globe during one flood? I know you've poked and prodded enough creationists to have this answer for me, Mark.
We have fossils, obviously, by riverbeds, but they weren't just, that's not the only place they fossilize. It's the riverbeds cut into the soil that allows us to find the fossils. There's probably fossils under the very ground you're on right now. If you were to dig down deep enough, there'd probably be fossils.
False. Absolutely false. There may be fossils underneath you. There may not. Depends on if you're in a fossil formation. Depends on if you're over a area where the formation had organisms that fossilized. Fossilization just doesn't happen all the time. It happens at very select points in time. Catastrophes are a good example of it. Again, we mentioned volcanoes before. Floods are a good example of situations that would cause that. Meteor strikes. We had the rainforest collapse was another one where the oxygen level went too high and the rainforest collapsed, and that's where we get our coal deposits. But there's lots of cool creatures in there. There is just amber. Amber happens sporadically. It happens. We find them more in specific environments. That's why we have specific formations like the Myanmar amber and things like that, Baltic amber. But the situations that cause these fossilization processes are varied and many. Yeah, Mark, I know that's our answer to it. I know that's absolutely our answer to it. That they haven't had enough time in that environment. I wanted to know if you knew if you'd ever heard a creationist response on that, because I know you engaged them about this topic specifically quite often. I didn't know if anybody had ever explained to you why we have some bones that are fossilized and some bones that are subfossil. Our uniformitarian, as they would call it, explanation is that subfossil ones haven't been there as long as the fossilized bones, and I think that pans out and that makes sense, because we see more modern, like more organisms that are more modern leaving, or we find subfossil finds, but organisms that are less modern we find only fossil finds like dinosaurs. Interesting that. Oh shoot, let me jump back. Where was I?
By scavengers, so on. To fossilize, it must be buried. And so this raises a question. How did things get buried all over the earth? Because we have fossils on top of mountains.
There are, again, lots of factors for how something could get buried.
We have fossils, obviously, by riverbeds, but they weren't just, that's not the only place they fossilize. It's the riverbeds cut into the soil that allows us to find the fossils. There's probably fossils under the very ground you're on right now. If you were to dig down deep enough, there'd probably be fossils underneath right where you're at
that's
today.
Where we were. Okay.
There are places like you see where there's been dinosaur digs, and you've got big dinosaurs. How do they get buried? How did these huge animals get buried so that we could find their bones?
Yeah, a lot of factors, but you got to also remember that these organisms lived millions of years ago, and the main composition of soil is the remains of organisms. Soil is organic. So after Kent Hovind seems to have this. Where does the new material come from? Does it come from space? No, it comes from organisms growing and dying and growing and dying. It comes from plants and fungi and animals too, living their life cycles and dying and accumulating the mass of their what remains of them after scavenging and elemental degradation of their physical forms. They turn to soil. It's the same reason why your sidewalk, why if you don't trim the edges on your sidewalk, why the grass creeps over it, and then if you let it go for a couple of years, you lift that up and there's dirt underneath there. That's the decay of previous generations and elements. Um, and it confuses me that they don't understand that, and that's a couple of years on your sidewalk, right? A couple of years, yeah, your sidewalk gets buried. There's sidewalks that are buried completely. There's sidewalks that are buried under inches of dirt after just a couple of centuries of just sitting there, not anything happening, and just plants growing over them and dying back, going over and dying back. Soil overtakes them. Gravity acts on them. They find their way under the ground. It's not a hard process, and millions of years pass, they may find themselves several feet, several meters underground. That's to be expected.
You go to a place like Dinosaur National Monument, and you find deep burial ground of these dinosaurs. Well, obviously there must have been some sort of cataclysmic event that buried them. We believe that cataclysmic event is found in Genesis chapter 6 through 9.
Right, and that's under the presumption that how much deposition is over top of them now is how much deposition has been over top of them the entire time that they've been since the organism died. That's not the case. They were not buried by they could have been, but not all fossils and not all organisms were buried by meters and meters of sediment in order to be fossilized. A lot of that sediment has been laid down over the eons since the organisms died. In some cases, at least millennia since the organism died.
It is the flood of Noah's time. Now, God flooded the whole earth during the time of Noah. He had a reason for doing it. The earth had become corrupt, filled with violence. He regretted that he'd made man, and the flood is a judgment upon humanity and a judgment upon the earth.
And a judgment upon the animals and the plants and the fungi and the with all the other archaea and bacteria. All those things are being punished because in a garden some lady ate an apple. That is the reason why we have fossils. Mm-hmm.
We've seen recently here, even in our country, the devastating effects of a hurricane and what a flood can do to the earth and all that's on it.
It's not making the case you think you're making, bud. You're saying that these kind of things happen in real time that we can view and demonstrate.
And here we're talking about a flood that only lasted a few hours. We're talking about a storm surge of maybe, 10 feet? It might have been a little bit higher. Last I heard, it was only about 10 feet. And you look at the devastation that came from just a few hours flood of a few 10 feet of a storm surge. Imagine a flood so great that the earth was covered. Imagine that it rained for 40 days and nights, but the earth was actually covered for about a year by this flood. Imagine what that would have done to the sediment, to the forest, to the face of the earth. It would have had devastating effects. All of animals would have been buried in the flood waters, in the sediment as it settled. And indeed, we believe this is why it was at this flood event that gave us the sedimentary layers that we see, like at a place like if you see it like the Grand Canyon, where you see the various layers. This is what we believe it came from there. So the fossil, this is an important thing, because many people talk about the fossils without thinking, how do we get the earth? How do we get fossils all over the earth? If the flood,
because you just demonstrated one way that these events happen. A hurricane is a good flood catalyst. Also, the monsoon seasons, rivers annually flood. That'll grab up anything that's died in the floodplain in the last few months. Since the last flood season, will gather up all the bones, especially the megafauna, and wash them on down river, where they'll tend to collect in batches if it's all from the same floodplain, or get washed up in the same area and collect in a mound. And then, like I was saying before, we get a layer of sediment over them. Maybe not even get a layer of sediment over them. Maybe just organic material growing over top of them, funguses and plants growing over top of them over multiple generations, submerge them deep into the soil. Yeah, this idea that it has to be rapid. There's a certain notion to how articulate and how much of an organism remains that does come into play, that say that had to been rapid for it to be in this position and this much of it preserved. But if you find, just a single bone can be absorbed into the earth just over seasonal changes, over seasonal plant and fungus and other organisms die back and cover it in soil, taking them back into the earth, or taking it right back to the earth. It doesn't even have to start off buried.
Flood happened. If the flood occurred, as the Bible says, and if it did cover the earth, and you say there's not enough water, well, certainly there's enough water. There actually is enough water. If the earth did not have mountains or valleys, there'd be enough water. Are you ready for this? To cover the whole earth, I believe 2 miles deep. 2 miles deep with all the water that's even presently on the earth right now. So what did we have? It was during this cataclysmic event, it did more than just rain. You understand that it also said the deeps were broken up, that water came from the depths of.
Yeah, so, but it's not even a matter of where the water came from. I can grant you that there was enough water that there was enough water in the environment to cover that. I can say that before the flood that there was that much water on the earth, or hidden in the fountains of the deep and outside the windows of the heavens and all that good stuff. My question to you is, where did it go? Where did the water end up? I don't understand. Where did it go back into the fountains of the deep? And if so, where are these fountains? And can we explore them and find the water? And is the composition of the water the same as the composition of the surface water? Did it get sucked back out to the windows? Where are these windows of heaven that are opening up and pouring in the flood waters? Where are they? And can we observe them? And can we look at, is there more water beyond the windows? You raise more questions than answers, whereas the model that we use for the fossilization process, outside of the Bible, of course, is a naturalistic process that fits and matches with the observations. Because, as I was talking about before with Mark in the side chat, modern species are found in subfossil state, and then there are organisms that are found in both fossilized and subfossil states, which were mostly we have a lot of mammalian megafauna that crosses over from having representatives from like the Miocene, Oligocene, that are fossilized, and then organisms from more recent eras, like the Pleistocene, that are not fossilized. We can see proboscideans are a good example of that. That's the elephant group in that clade, right? So we have a representation of the fossilization process through the ages, and at what point organisms that we're finding are subfossil and non-subfossil. So we have different classes of these bones and things that we're finding in these fields, not just one layer where everything's laid down the same and they're all in a uniform state.
The earth, the continents seem to collide. The mountains, probably many of the mountains formed during this time. And this is why we have the fossils that are found up on top of mountains. They were submerged in water, and the plate tectonics, the crash, there were earthquakes during this time. It was a cataclysmic event, more than just rain.
And I'm not even going to bring up and hold him accountable for the heat problem, because I don't think that Tom has even considered that. But yeah, there's what he's talking about with the mountains crashing into each other, with the continents crashing into each other, and fountains of the deep opening, and springs and rain and all that. The heat is going to be an issue. Mount Everest sprung up in 4,000 years. Must have made trade routes between China and India more difficult. Yeah, I know, like the road just all of a sudden, boom, because they had 4,000 years ago, there's commerce. They had marketplaces in these countries, where all of a sudden mountains are springing up between civilizations and making it harder for them to interact. That sucks. Yeah, there's history 4,000 years ago, 6,000 years ago. We have 10,000 years ago, we have foundations of civilizations that there are civilizations that have been ongoing. But yeah, so I just wanted to comment on that. Let's see here, Big Bad Mama. It's called the Big Bad Mama film series. Angie Dickerson is Big Bad Mama.
This would have been perhaps how the mountain ranges were formed.
We love you, Big Bad Mama.
Therefore, on top of the mountains, because they weren't there at the beginning of the flood. This life died, and the mountains emerged during this time. So this raises some questions. How do you account for if you're going to ask an evolutionist about the fossil record, how do you account for complex forms of life being found in the supposedly oldest layers in the geological column? This is the first question we want to ask, because keep in mind, they believe that the layers that are the furthest down are the oldest layers. What we believe is that they were just the ones that they weren't that much older. They were just laid down in the flood, and that layer settled there first, and another layer settled on top, another layer settled on top. But there's complex life. These trilobites, for instance, these are complex life fossils that were found in this oldest layer.
That's not even close to true. The earliest life that we have is was it 4.2 billion years ago, right? Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's 4.2. And then part of my brain saying it was 2.4, and I've transposed it in my brain. So I've transposed it. So I think it's 4.2 though. And the Cambrian explosion, which he cited in his previous slide as the lowest layer, was 500 some million years ago. So like a fraction of the time ago, it's not even close to the same time frame. The earliest life, 3.6 or 3.7. That might be right. I thought they moved it back to 4.2. But 4.2 that'd be almost Hadean, right? Yeah. Then there's Ediacaran. All these organisms that existed well before the Cambrian explosion. And Cambrian explosion is a misnomer anyway, because the explosion is a 50 million year period. 50 million years is if you went back in time 50 million years, you would be looking at a post-apocalyptic world that was it only just started to revive from the KT extinction event. Like recently, within just a few million years ago, the world would still be in turmoil from that extinction event. There were certain areas, of course, that were prospering, but yeah, just to give you an idea how long 50 million years is, basically as long as the age of mammals since the dinosaurs died till now. It's within that same time range. So 50 million years is a long time for organisms to diversify in response to ecological pressures of the environment, other organisms in the environment. We see giant shifts. The Cambrian explosion itself was poignantly an end to an era of this where we had just these microbial mats that just covered everything, at least everything underwater, just covered the entire beds of the oceans. And then with the Cambrian explosion, suddenly we had, and it was these acorn worms that really started the process. They started doing that started just burrowing right into it, and it started breaking up these mats, and other organisms, trilobites, like you mentioned, and things like that, but more primitive organisms as well, started to develop during this time frame and break up these mats and totally change the face of the planet. And that's why we have what we call the Cambrian explosion, because all of a sudden there were these new hard-bodied organisms that were taking advantage of this new ecology that never existed before, because again, everything was uniform before. It was just these big microbial mats of transitional organisms. It's funny to say because they're single-celled organisms that were living in colonies, right? But we move forward from there, and then they started having hard bodies, and we have this amazing fossil record because there was nothing that was breaking down these hard-bodied organisms. And due to the nature of the environment, the calcified remains were easily absorbed into the substrate and fossilized. And then millions of years later, we had tectonic movement that pushed these former seabeds up into mountain ranges, and now we have things like the Burgess Shale right in the middle of the Rocky Mountains that was once a shallow, warm seabed with a plethora of organisms from this era that he's talking about.
No question. Why, after 160 years of searching, have evolutionists not found one single genuine transitional link in the fossil record? That's a controversial question, because they would say they have, and yet we would say they haven't.
So Dapper Dino has a fun slide that he does when he has to step away. It's just a slide of hundreds of transitional fossils. I wish I could borrow it for just to respond to this, but he's going to dig into our feather boy over here. So let's give him a chance to let's give him some more rope.
And I have over here on that slide, if you're watching on YouTube, if you're listening to the podcast, you'll have to picture this yourself. But if you see, there's a fossil here of what's known as Archaeopteryx.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Archaeopteryx is a strange fossil because what is it? Is it a bird? Is it a dinosaur? What is it? We can't really know.
Yes to both. It's a bird and it's a dinosaur. Because you can't be a bird without being a dinosaur. Dinosauria is a clade of archosaur reptiles. Reptiles being, to keep it monophyletic, reptiles includes birds. Birds are reptiles. Okay, so archosaurs they've branched off from the other reptile groups like lepidosaurs, lizards and snakes, and testuodine turtles. The archosaurs branched off, and you have crocodilians like crocodiles. You have pterosaurs, the quintessential pterodactyls, and you have some clades of smaller reptilian groups as well that fall into this group. And then you have Dinosauria. So early on, after the Permian extinction event, these groups really started to diversify. And at first, in the early Triassic, the crocodilians, that clade of archosaurs itself, really took the lead and became the dominant organisms for a long time. But dinosaurs did find their origins during the Triassic, during this period of crocodilian supremacy, which did last for most of the Triassic. You had they almost filled like a theropod-like niche. Look at some of the Crotosuchians. I think that's still the proper term. They've changed. They've regrouped it again. So like things like para. Or pseudo crocodilians, para crocodilians are all now nested under crocodilians, which is kind of ironic because their name means beside, right? Anyway, what was I saying? Oh yeah, dinosaurs rose among this group of archosaur reptiles. Dinosaurs kind of took the lead, right? There were these small, tiny, fast-running little creatures, but then they kind of dominated for the rest of the Mesozoic era, and we ended up with the giant sauropods and the huge theropods. Now the theropods, the huge ones, might have seemed like the most successful group at the time, but it was really the small generalists that were able to find and carve out a niche for themselves, and those were the Maniraptorans. Now Maniraptorans, there were some huge ones. There's some very massive Maniraptorans, but for the most part, they're small, light, hollow boned. We'll call them bird-like, which is kind of funny since birds it's in this group, the Maniraptorans. But then dromaeosaurs are also in the Maniraptorans. Those are like Velociraptor in that group, and they actually look more like birds than what you see in like the movies, like Jurassic Park movies and things like that. But I digress. The ones that survived this next extinction event were the aves, the modern birds. Okay, so there are Maniraptorans. Maniraptorans are theropods. Theropods are dinosaurs. That is nested cladistics. So all birds are Maniraptorans, all modern birds, because Maniraptora is a group of, birds are a group of Maniraptorans. All Maniraptorans are theropods because Maniraptorans are a group of theropods, like within that group. and so forth, all the way back to Archosaurs. You can go even further back to amniotes and tetrapods and vertebrates and so forth. You never outgrow your ancestor.
Oh, and this has been put forth as a transitional form by many evolutionists. And yet I've got to think back in my own life to a time when at the University of Maryland, we brought in a paleontologist to give a lecture on creation evolution. His name was Dr. Parker. And his first name's slipping me right now, but Dr. Parker's written a number of books. Well, anyway, he gave this talk. Afterwards, and I was known on the campus there at Maryland because I preach every day, and I got to know the head of the zoology department, and he came to the lecture, and there's a lot of students there. And afterwards, I asked him, I said, what did you think of the lecture? And the professor said, well, he's disappointed. He said, I expected more depth to it. I expected better, more rigorous questions to be raised. He said it was just straw man arguments. I said, well, what do you mean? Give me an example. He said, well, like, for instance, Archaeopteryx. So what do you mean? He said, well, listen, no real evolutionists, no real scientists has believed Archaeopteryx is a transitional form in over 40 years.
False. It's because you changed the terminology of what a transitional form is. So all species are in some stage of transition, whether you're experiencing a radiation event or not, is what's going to see rapid physiological or morphological changes in an organism. Is if something's spurning forward, it's radiation, like an extinction event that causes a niche vacuum where organisms that did not formally live in a specific environment or fill a specific ecological niche find success in that ecological niche after the previous placeholders have gone extinct. That's a niche vacuum that will cause organisms to undergo physiological, behavioral, and even dietary changes in their anatomy that's present in the fossils that they leave behind of that generation. But for the most part, organisms, for most of the time that a species exists, if there's stability in the ecosystem, will remain largely unchanged or only experience subtle morphological changes.
I was a little taken aback by that. I didn't know what to think, and he said he's disappointed. Then right after that, a zoology student, when he left, our conversation was over. A zoology student who attended the lecture, he came and said, "What did he say to you? He's the head of our zoology department. What did he say?" And I told him what he said about Archaeopteryx being a straw man. No one believes it. He said, "Well, that's interesting, because just today in my zoology 400 class, our professor, who knew that we were going to be coming to this lecture tonight, said, 'How do we know evolution is true?' And he gave Archaeopteryx as an example of a transitional form in the fossil record as proof of evolution's true."
Why would Archaeopteryx not be a transitional species? I don't understand the case being made here. I've heard people say that because there were because there were birds discovered older than true birds discovered that are older than Archaeopteryx, but I don't understand how that means that it's not a transitional form, because it still shows the characteristics of when theropods started transitioning to, because the Archaeopteryx could be a branch that moved into an environment where it didn't need to change much and stayed static in that environment, whereas another lineage went on to an environment where it did require physiological changes in order to thrive under the environmental pressures, where only the ones that had certain characteristics survive, things like the teeth, for instance, vanishing from. And there are early birds that had teeth. Most of the birds, I believe, that existed in the Mesozoic had teeth. So, that there could have been another branch that came off of this to lead to modern birds does not change the fact that Archaeopteryx has transitional characteristics from Dinosauria to the Aves clade. They're still in the same. They're still in this, wrapped up in that same group.
I got back with the chairman of the department. I said, I told him the story. I completed the circle. I said, "You told me no legitimate scientists believe this, and yet this is being taught in your zoology classes in your department. What do you think about that?" And he said, "Well," and his answer was, "I don't have control over what they say." And he kind of skirted the issue. My friends, what do we say?
Stirred the issue. Sounds like he just told you that, hey, I don't write the curriculum. I mean, maybe he said more. I don't know.
Some of the people who make such confident assertions maybe shouldn't be so confident after all. Now, I'm going to admit there's much to learn about the area of fossils. And as I've said throughout this entire series, I hope you understand.
Look, okay, so we will never say about any fossil that we found, that this individual organism is a direct ancestor to a modern different clade that evolved from the same group. We will never say that this individual dinosaur, that this individual theropod is the direct ancestor of birds. We won't say that based on a fossil. We will say this individual was part of a clade that is either a sister clade or ancestral to this derived clade. We're never going to say that this individual fossil that we found here in the ground, or even that this individual species of the fossil we found in the ground is the direct ancestor of a group, unless we see it in real time, which does happen. We do see speciation in real time, especially in the domestication process. But there's enough genetic changes, for instance, in the wolf clade to designate dog as its own species, and we've done that in real time. I think he does a prayer here, but if he starts praying, I'm going to probably end it. But let's let him finish up.
I ask myself, if I'm going to be a creationist or an evolutionist, which are the difficult questions I'm most comfortable not having good answers to yet? There's still great research being done. I will admit that as a creationist, there are tough questions that we're still struggling with. We don't claim to have found all of it. We're presenting a paradigm, a model that to us makes sense, and it provides a great deal of answers that fit right in with the Bible. If you see it in light of, for instance, in this case, the worldwide flood, if you believe it really happened, as the Bible says, suddenly the whole fossil record takes on a whole new perspective. Because how do we get those fossils? Was it laid down quickly?
Suddenly the whole fossil record doesn't make any sense, right? Like, why are all the dinosaurs fossilized, but not all the proboscideans and percydactyls, these other huge organisms? Why are none of them? Why are some of them subfossil and then all of the dinosaurs are subfossil? I guess the bone density should be about comparable, right? The body mass would be comparable. I know that the Dinosauria does make better use of mass to weight ratio, so they are similar mass. Dinosauria is going to be Dinosaurian. A similar mass dinosaur is going to be much lighter than the same mass of like a mammalian or mammal. I keep using the scientific classification. I don't have to use that with you guys. I mammal and dinosaur. A dinosaur and a mammal that look the same size, the mammal's going to weigh substantially more. But the dinosaur can potentially be equally as strong. That's why a 35-pound eagle can tangle with a 150-pound gray wolf and sometimes come out on top, because the ratio there, we do get ratioed pretty hard by birds, pound for pound.
Really that old? Are these layers really that old? And so are these fossils really that old? You begin to see things in a whole different light if you look at it in light of the historical account in the scripture. There's questions, I believe, that if you're going to have the evolutionist, the old earth point of view, there's tough questions that can't be answered by them. And if you're going to have ours, there's tough questions that we don't have the answers yet either. Which set of questions am I most comfortable not being answered? Well, I go with the Bible. And I feel that there's so much. We creationists have such limited budgets. We have such limited resources. The other side has, like every university in America, the Smithsonian, the big museums, the big budgets. We are doing so much with so little, and yet I believe putting forth a real argument that it happened just as the Bible says. And so that's where I stand, the fossil record.
But you're where you stand. The fossil record doesn't actually make sense, though. The flood model does not explain the deposition of fossils and what is fossilized and what's not fossilized, where fossils are found, what types of fossils are found in what layers of the geological column. The geological column is a whole in and of itself. Tectonic activity, all of that goes out the window with the flood model. None of what we understand about any of those things makes any sense. And this is because this has real-time application, because we're talking about ecology here too, which is the way organisms move and why organisms are where they are, why organisms were where they were, and what types of environments existed in this area and for how long, which really throws a big ass monkey wrench into this flood model when they say that all of the layers were laid down in one day, because it's not layers of just mud with fossils in them. It's layers of ecologies. It's layers of, here's a forest, now there's a desert, now there's a swamp, now there's an ocean, now there's a desert, now there's an ocean, now there's this forest. It's layered like that. It's not just mud with different kinds of fossils in it. There's different ecosystems that thrived in that area. I tried to explain that to Cindy Lincoln, but she just I don't think that she was really following what I was saying. I'd love to talk to her one-on-one.
Father in heaven, we bless you today and we worship you, and we think today, as we think of
here's
fossils,
the
Lord,
prayer.
we could sit and argue about it. But
Okay, we're going to stop right here because I'm not going to listen to him pray. That's a personal thing he does with his religious audience. I'm not going to disparage them for praying. Lots of cultures pray. It's not for me. Not my cup of tea. So that was CreationWatch with what's his channel called again? It's Tom Short, but his channel's called Tom Short too. I thought he had it named after, this is like he calls himself Tom the Preacher. That's his website, tomthepreacher.com. So I wasn't sure, but yeah, his channel's just called Tom Short. Yeah, and not very compelling on the arguments for flood geology.